The first 2 weeks of the NFL season are now behind us, and we are on to week number 3. Some surprise pass catchers are lurking inside the top 20 for fantasy purposes, including Troy Franklin at number 11, coming off a 24-point performance there in week number 2. We also have Hunter Renfrow, who posted a 23.8-point performance against the Cardinals. Conversely, Calvin Ridley, Devonta Smith, Josh Downs, they all reside outside of the top 50 in PPR scoring formats. That said, we are here to make sense of it all with RotoBaller's Week 3 starts and sits at the wide receiver position. And we kick things off with DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers as they take on the New England Patriots. Heading into Foxborough may be precisely what DK Metcalf needs to get himself right after being held to just 7 receptions on 13 targets through the first 2 weeks of the season. Last week, Metcalf, he was supposed to have a revenge game, but that narrative did not go as planned. Cooper Kupp, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Torrey Horton, Elijah Rojo, A.J. Barner all finished with more than the 20 receiving yards that Metcalf finished with. Both Reek Woolen and Josh Jobe, they did their job in coverage, so this week it really comes down to whether or not Christian Gonzalez can suit up for a Patriots secondary in desperate need. As for the Patriots, they surrendered 40.9 fantasy points to the Raiders wide receivers back in week number 1, and that doesn't include what Brock Bowers was able to do, his 103 yards receiving in that contest. Then last week, Tyreek Hill got himself right with 109 receiving yards, and Jalen Waddle added 68 yards and a touchdown, pushing the Dolphins receivers to 49.8 fantasy points against New England. Add that up and you get 424 yards and a pair of touchdowns for 45.37 fantasy points per game against the second most this season. Another wide receiver I feel good about, it is George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys as they head to Chicago to take on the Bears. After seeing just 4 targets in his Dallas Cowboys debut, Pickens played a much larger role in the Cowboys offense last week when the Cowboys defeated the Giants in overtime. In Pickens' second contest, he earned 9 targets, hauling in 5 for 68 receiving yards, doubling his total from the previous weeks. While the yardage alone isn't enough to get fantasy managers excited, if you turn on the film, you'll see a receiver who has been drawing pass interference calls all the way down the field. Now, there's no bonus for pass interference yardage. However, those calls are a good sign that Pickens is getting open and being targeted, and it's only a matter of time. This week, expect the deep ball to continue to fly as Dallas faces the Bears secondary that just surrendered 4 touchdowns and 268 receiving yards to the position against the Detroit Lions. The 65.2 fantasy points against, that was the second most in week number 2. Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamison Williams each eclipsed 100 yards receiving, with Williams accomplishing that feat on just 2 catches for 64 and 44 yards respectively. The third start of the week, how about Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears? Hey, we're going to keep things going with this matchup. We have to ask ourselves, which defense for the Dallas Cowboys is going to show up in week number 3? The one that allows 74 fantasy points to Giants pass catchers, or the one that held A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith to 15.3 fantasy points and 83 total yards, which Jahan Dotson was actually probably the most responsible wide receiver when it came to that fantasy production. Through Odunze's first 2 games this season, the second-year wideout has 13 receptions, 165 receiving yards, which happens to be the 9th most, and 3 touchdown receptions, which leads the league. If Odunze can see similar type of usage as he did in week number 2, we're talking 100% snap share, a 33% target share, a 59% air yardage share against the Dallas Cowboys secondary that we saw last week, Odunze, he could finish as the overall wide receiver 1 in fantasy and could be atop of the overall rankings when all is said and done. Last season, Odunze's targets per route run were about 16.3%, first downs per route run at 6%, and his yards per route run was 1.18. This season, those numbers have increased across the board. 26.3% targets per route run, 11.8% first downs per route run, and 2.17 yards per route run. Put that all together, mix it in a bowl, it's all a recipe for success. Now let's talk about those wide receivers who are not projected to have much success here in week number 3. And I'm going to keep going with Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders as they take on the Las Vegas Raiders. We're entering the 3rd week of the NFL season. Terry McLaurin has just 7 receptions for 75 yards. That's the 3rd most on his own team, and he is still without a touchdown. While the targets 13 and the yards per reception 10.7 are encouraging, missing much of camp due to contract negotiations has really factored into McLaurin's early season struggles. Digging a little deeper into the data, McLaurin's 18.1% target share in the first 2 weeks of the season, that is down compared to the 23.1% target share he earned a season ago. Part of that could be a result of missing time, while some of that could be attributed to the upgrade from Diami Brown playing opposite him in Deebo Samuel Sr., who has already earned himself a 25% target share. Now, for the record, Dyami Brown down in Jacksonville, he has already got 8 receptions for 108 yards and a touchdown. Historically, we've seen this play out where receivers who have held out due to contract demands or whatnot have had slow starts to their seasons. In recent memories, we witnessed Samuel and Brandon Ayuk go through the exact same thing. Another wide receiver that I'm sitting this week is Chris Olave of the Saints as they take on the Seattle Seahawks. Here's the thing with Chris Olave. The Saints quarterback play, it is foul, and that may be a generous comment. Olave has seen 13 targets and 10 targets in his 2 games this season, which, that's good. Olave, he's only come away with 54 receiving yards in both those contests, which is underwhelming considering the volume. At best, Olave is a volume play that could be a wide receiver 2 any given week. This is all about the poor quarterback play he is currently burdened with. I don't know how often Olave has worked himself open to see the ball either go to another wide receiver or completely sail over his head. This week, it doesn't get any easier facing a formidable Seahawks secondary that just limited DK Metcalf to 3 receptions and 20 yards. Seattle, they head into this contest as the top-ranked fantasy defense against opposing wide receivers, holding them to 17.15 fantasy points per game after allowing just 11 receptions and 173 yards to the position through 2 weeks. In the final sit of the week, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles as they take on the Los Angeles Rams. It's a little too early to panic, but when we're talking about A.J. Brown, that panic meter has to be hitting a solid 7 right now. Through 2 weeks, the Eagles and Brown have faced 2 teams inside the top 7 regarding fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. The Kansas City Chiefs, they were allowing 39.95 fantasy points per game. Well, the Dallas Cowboys, they're allowing 44.65. Yet A.J. Brown is currently the wide receiver 80 thus far, averaging just 4.8 fantasy points per game after facing both of those teams. And if you're looking for a positive in all this, Brown's week 1 to week 2 production, there was a 300% increase. Still wasn't good, but it was still an increase. But considering that Dallas Goedert wasn't available last week, fantasy managers have to be disheartened with the performance. Coming off of week number 1, going into week number 2, there was a glimmer of hope. That was completely squashed. It is hard to ignore the numbers. Well, target share is positive, 21.9%. The 6 receptions for 35 yards and an average depth of target of 7.4 are not something you want to get excited about, and neither is this matchup. Through the Rams' first 2 contests, the secondary, they have performed well, limiting opposing receivers to 23 receptions for 252 yards and a touchdown. For fantasy purposes, that equates to 27.8 fantasy points against the 7th fewest and the most challenging matchup for Brown yet. If you haven't already done so, hit the like and hit that follow button, and be sure to head to RotoBaller.com for all the latest news and fantasy analysis. We'll see you next time.